this is one of the chunkiest, heaviest, and most powerful portable, if you can call it that, portable devices on the market right now. It's the xDuoo XD-05 Pro. It's got some really unique features, lots of customization and versatility, and so I was really excited to get my hands on it and give it a try. If you know anything about this one already, you'll probably know that there's going to be lots of ground to cover here in this review. So I'm guessing it's going to be a long one. Obviously I haven't recorded it yet, and I will try to get through it as quickly as I can, but this is probably going to be a bit of a long haul. Hopefully though, a very interesting one. So grab yourself your favorite drink, snack, meal, etc. and let's talk about the XD-05 Pro. I'm going to kick things off with a short introduction before we dive into all the variants of sound quality with the XD-05 Pro. And then I'll come back around at the end and talk about any other bits and pieces we haven't already covered, such as the device tour, ins and outs, connectivity, etc. But the first things you need to know about the XD-05 Pro is that it comes in with a retail price of $799 which is really high for a portable device, but there's a good reason for that, and that's the technology and the versatility that it comes packing. When you buy the XD-05 Pro, it's going to come with a top-of-the-range ES9039S Pro DAC chip installed, but you can actually buy other DAC chips for it in these little carts here, and you can get the Rohm DAC chip. I'm going to put the exact model number on the screen, the Rohm DAC chip for $149, or you can get the excellent AKM AK4499EX DAC chip for $199. I hadn't heard the Rohm DAC chip before, so I was excited to try it here in the XD-05 Pro, and I'll of course cover off exactly how they sound in the XD-05 Pro when we get to sound quality in just a moment. Before we get there though, you probably also need to know that the XD-05 Pro comes with the OPA1612 op amps fitted, but it also comes with a pair of LME49720 op amps. If those numbers mean nothing to you, all you need to know is that you can swap around the sound and the character of the amp stage, and you can even fit some premium op amps such as the Sparkos Labs SS3602, so we'll cover all that too. Finally, if we start talking specs, the XD-05 Pro can output a whopping 2 watts into a 32 ohm load. That's absolutely heaps for a portable device like this. And it'll carry that level of power output all the way up to a 300 ohm load where it's still pumping out 930 milliwatts, which is way more than I've ever needed for any kind of high impedance headphone. The final two key things to mention, and I know there's a lot more to cover, I'll get to that at the end, but the final two things to mention is that it's also got Bluetooth, including aptX HD and LDAC, and it'll give you about 11 hours of battery life from the DAC and headphone amp running together, or if you're just running an analog input and therefore only the headphone amp, that bumps all the way up to about 20 hours of use. Now of course battery life varies depending on the difficulty of the load, how loud you're listening, things like that, but to have 11 hours on tap, even with the DAC and the headphone amp running, that's huge. And so now, before we dive into talking about sound quality, the final thing I want to say is a huge thanks to Apos for sending this one out. They were kind enough to send me both the XD-05 Pro and the 2 different DAC cards so I can talk about those, share some full impressions with you, lots of comparisons, so let's dive into it now. I thought the first thing to do when it came to sound quality for the XD-05 Pro was just to try it straight out of the box. Now I say straight out of the box, I've used it for ages, it's had plenty of burn-in and use before I sat down and did my testing, but the point is I reinstalled the ESS DAC card, I reinstalled the OPA1612s, so it was exactly as it originally came out of the box when I did my first impressions listening in terms of my notes. And whilst I generally feel like it's very difficult to describe a device like this in isolation, what I will say is that the sound is clean, crisp and detailed, but not at all harsh. And overall, it's just got that very enjoyable xDuoo sound style. Which is to say it's not a detail monster, it's not going to blow you away with resolution, but it's going to give you an enjoyable listening experience even in its absolute stock form. While we're talking about generic sound quality, it is worth noting that even on what's called eco mode, which is like its low gain mode, there is a little bit of hiss through sensitive IEMS. It's not enough that it would ever get in my way of enjoying the IEMS, but it's not an absolutely pristine background if you've got sensitive IEMs. As I've already alluded to though, I don't think you can really describe a device like this in isolation, because at a certain level they all sound great, and this certainly does. And so I think what's going to be more helpful is to start rolling through some comparisons of the different DAC stages and then the different op amps. And I'm going to kick things off with the DAC stages, work out which one I think is best, and of course describe the pros and cons of each to you, and then we'll look at the op amps with whatever I think is the very best DAC card. And so running in no particular order, just the order I picked them up off my desk, I began with the stock ESS DAC card, that being the 9039 Pro, And I compared that to the AKM AK4499EX. Listening to Heartburn by Alicia Keys and using the new Meza Lyric 2 headphones. The review for those, by the way, is coming very soon, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see that one. But listening with the Lyric 2s and starting off with the ESS DAC chip installed, the sound, as I've already said, was great. The bass on this track was really present, solid and tight, but everything was presented in quite a left-right spread. There wasn't much depth to speak about within the soundstage. The vocals were quite close to me as the listener, with the backing vocals kind of level on each side, and the hi-hat in particular stood out just off to the left of Alicia Keys' vocals. Overall, I'd say that the texture and clarity was excellent across the board. It was overall a very enjoyable sound, but I did feel like I wanted and expected a little bit more depth, and I was curious to see if either of the other DAC cards could deliver it, starting off with the AKM. Moving over to the AKM DAC card now, and straight away one of the first things I noticed was that the hi-hats on this track were a little bit less tizzy, a little bit less kind of metallic and aggressive or over-enhanced from the AK4499EX. Now that's not to say the ESS sounded bad, but it was like things were a bit better balanced from the AKM card. Thinking about the bass, which was so impressive from the ESS, I feel like the AKM didn't give me quite the same sense of presence and weight to the bass. It was still very good, but not quite as tight and not quite as impactful or authoritative from the AKM card. On the other hand, what I was getting from the AKM was that sense of depth that was lacking before. Now, Alicia Keys' vocals were probably still in the same place as before, so it was still fairly intimate, but the backing vocals were like they were a step back and off to the side still. So there's not a huge amount of depth coming from the AKM card, but it's definitely a step forward from the ESS, and some of this could be limited by the op amps, so we'll cover that off when we get to op amp rolling. For me at this point, I found the AKM sound to be overall more enjoyable. As I said, the ESS wasn't bad, but to me the AKM had a more natural overall sound. It didn't have the same sense of, almost an enhanced sense of clarity that I think the ESS does. And so to me, it was a little bit less energetic, but no less resolving and detailed, if that makes sense, and therefore more enjoyable for the longer listen. The ESS was impressive in its sense of detail and articulation and attack, but it was the AKM that I wanted to keep coming back and listen to more. And so knowing that the AKM was currently my favourite, it was now time to put the AKM chip up against the Rohm chip. Rohm is a relatively small player in the market compared to ESS and AKM, and I hadn't yet heard their DAC chip, as I said earlier, so I was really keen to try it out. It's meant to be a very musical and vocal-focused DAC chip, and so I was interested to know what that would bring, and I happened to stumble across Isn't This a Lovely Day by Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, and thought that would be a good starting point. Starting off with the AKM DAC chip that was already installed, and the first thing I noticed was a little bit of hiss coming through from this recording. It's there in the recording, it's an old recording, so it's not a knock on this system. But then as the vocals came in, they were absolutely gorgeous from the AKM DAC chip. Ella Fitzgerald's voice was clear, it was natural, it sounded like it was a proper tonality with no skewing in any direction, just very, very enjoyable. And then when Louis Armstrong's vocals came in, that was almost even better again in the sense that, I don't know if Louis was singing closer to the microphone, but you could hear every texture, every detail in his very raspy, kind of hoarse voice. You could hear the small sounds of his mouth moving close to the microphone. It was really, really enjoyable. Now, I know some people are actually turned off by that level of detail, and so I'm not saying it's necessarily what everybody wants, but the AKM was clearly bringing out all of that information that was captured in the original recording. It is worth noting that the way this recording's been mixed, recorded, mastered, whatever, the backing vocals are quite muted. So every single instrument feels like it's had some of the energy pulled out of it. I don't know if it was the way they set up the mics in the studio, if it's the way they've mixed it later on, but it's hard to kind of gauge too much in terms of sound quality from those backing instrumentals. So this was very much a vocal test, and I will talk about a different track in a second so that we cover a more kind of wider range track. We'll go back to the Alicia Keys track. Before we get there though, let's stick to the Ella and Louis track and move over to the Rohm DAC card. Straight away, it's a smoother sound, there is no doubt about that. Whether or not that's better, it's going to be up to you. And the first thing I'd say is that Ella's vocals are smooth, creamy, and super enjoyable from the Rohm DAC card. On the other hand, when you get to Louis' vocals, some of that texture, detail, and the mouth sounds, the kind of vocal movement noises, all that's actually reduced from the Rohm DAC card. So it's like it's rolling off or smoothing off some of the treble a little bit, or maybe not the treble so much as resolution and detail. And so for some people, that's going to be just what they're looking for. For other people, it's going to be too smooth. And unfortunately, there was not much else in this track that I could use to help me understand that, because as I said, the backing instrumentals are already quite muted. So I couldn't tell if there was less texture from the Rohm because it started at such a low level. Instead, I went back over to Heartburn by Alicia Keys, and kicking off with the Rohm DAC card still installed, this track sounded fantastic. And I think particularly the combination of this track on the lyrics with the Rohm DAC card, that made a perfect combination. The lyrics have got an interesting, slightly enhanced treble. I'll cover all that off in the full review. But I think the Rohm really helped to kind of balance it out in terms of the treble tonality from the lyrics with this particular track. It all came together really nicely. The Rohm card also handled Alicia Keys' vocals really well. The hi-hats were really well controlled as well in terms of tonality, position in space. Everything was going really well from the Rohm card. And in fact, I think the Rohm card might have brought back a little bit of extra bass, energy, presence, weight, authority, whatever word you want to put to it. There was a slightly greater sense of oomph or authority from the Rohm card in the bass compared to what I heard from the AKM card. Having said that, the AKM card wasn't bad on the bass. I just think the Rohm has a slightly fuller, warmer sound overall. Not a huge shift, but enough that you do notice it. However, where the AKM for me still pulls ahead is it gives a much clearer sense of layering and depth in the soundstage. And so the overall sense of space is improved with the AKM compared to the Rohm and compared to the ESS, and that makes the overall listening experience a more natural one where I feel like I can get lost in the music more. And so I'm not going to stand here and tell you which of these DAC chips is correct or better or worse. What I'm going to tell you is my preferences and where I think others may lean towards one or the other. As you probably already gathered, for me, the AKM is my preference, and that's because I think it balances an even-handed tonality with the right level of detail and resolution for what I'm looking for, and also it's got clearly, in my opinion, the best staging of the bunch. Because of its ability to separate the sounds, the instruments, into their layers in the soundstage, and therefore give an overall sense of depth and space in the soundstage. On the other hand, the Rohm DAC has its own benefits with its sense of smoothness and ease. As I said before, it's not a bad chip in terms of the resolution and detail it delivers. It's just a bit more easygoing than either of the other two. And so if you do have yourself a set of headphones or earphones, or sets of headphones or earphones that are a little bit detail-oriented, a bit energetic, a bit attacking or aggressive, the Rohm card could be just what you need. And for those of you that like the idea of R2R DACs and those smoother, warmer sounding DACs, that's where the Rohm card really fits into things. However, I believe in the future that xDuoo may release other DAC cards such as R2R ones. And so whether or not the Rohm is the one to go for now, or whether you should wait to see what the R2R DAC card is like, that's going to be a question that only you can answer. For now, I do think the Rohm is the best choice in the XD-05 for that smoother, richer sound. But if you lean in the other direction and you want detail and energy and clarity, that's where the ESS is still stronger. And so you've essentially got a continuum here. Warmth with the Rohm, balance with the AKM, energy, articulation and clarity with the ESS. But only the AKM gives you stage depth. From my listening, neither of the other two managed to do anything much more than a left-right two-dimensional stage. And so sticking with the AKM DAC card installed, let's now talk about the op amps. As I said, the XD-05 Pro comes with the OPA1612s installed, but it also comes with a set of LME49720 op amps that you can swap over very easily. All of this is done with just a little screwdriver that comes with it, and then it's all just plug and play from there. The only challenge is making sure you line up the op amps the right way so you don't blow them up, and that's pretty easy too. And so starting off with the AKM DAC card installed and the OPA1612s that came stock, I was listening to Purple Rain by Lucky Peterson. And kicking off, there was nothing specific to note about the sound from the OPA1612s. The tonality was natural, the soundstage was good, the general sense of detail, resolution, all that was fine. There was nothing that stood out to me as needing anything changed. But, because you get the LME49720s, I thought we'd try them. And switching over to those, for me at least, provided a better sound. Immediately, I felt like there was more space from the 49720s. They went a little bit wider than the OPA1612s, which I feel like kind of focused the image a bit more centrally. Going to the 49720s, I felt like everything had more space to breathe, rather than being funneled into more of almost a triangular shaped soundstage. And so the overall benefit to me was that the 49720s gave a better sense of space overall in the listening experience. And I also feel like the mid-range just came across a touch more neutral as well. The 1612s were a little, and we're talking tiny amounts here, but just a little tiny bit richer in the mid-range. And a slightly drier sound, and I mean this in terms of moving towards neutral away from warm. The slightly drier sound, the slightly cooler sound in the mids, I felt made it a more natural listening experience. It sounded more like I expected it to from the 49720s. However, this is all perception. I can only tell you what I'm hearing. If you happen to buy yourself an XD-05 Pro, you can switch between the two and work that out for yourself. And so it's impossible for me to say which of these is correct or better, but I did find myself preferring and sticking with the LME49720s. But of course, some of you will be buying this because you can roll op amps, and the op amp of choice for most people, it seems, is the Sparkos Labs SS3602, at least where space is an issue. For the record, you cannot fit something like a Burson V7 in here. I've looked at it, there is no way to make it fit. But the SS3602, which is also a brilliant op amp, they will fit in here. You do need to use a little dip 8 riser, so that's like a little adapter, almost like a socket saver for the op amps. You need to use those on one of the chips just to rise it up and clear it above one of the capacitors, but both of them will fit on the little op amp card. And then as you're putting it back into its little sort of space inside the chassis, you just need a little tiny bit of pressure to get the op amps to clear one of the screw thread where it's sort of molded into the chassis. So yes, you can fit the SS3602 from Sparkos Labs into the XD-05 Pro, and when you do, you get a remarkable improvement in sound, as you'd expect if you play with these op amps. The first thing that you notice is a much larger sense of space in the soundstage, and that's really helping us to get the benefits of something like that AKM DAC card. Now, by the way, for anyone thinking that I should go back and test the Rohm DAC card or the ESS DAC card with the Sparkos Labs, I have done that behind the scenes, and consistently it's the AKM that performs better, as I described before. The op amp allows you to hear more of what I've described, but it's absolutely not changing what I've described. The other thing to tell you about the SS3602s in the XD-05 Pro is that it brings a tonality that's probably more like the 1612. It's a little bit warmer and smoother sounding than the LME49720s, but, and this is the key, you're not losing any sense of detail, texture, clarity, or space. And so it's kind of like the perfect world. You're getting a smoother sound that's more relaxing and more enjoyable, but with no loss of soundstage space or size or texture, detail, resolution, etc. It's just a much, much better overall sound, and if you're in a position where you can afford to add a set of 3602s to this one, it's absolutely worthwhile. And so at this point, as you're probably seeing, we've got a very versatile device that can be upgraded through things like the AKM DAC card, some better op amps. And so before I get into a couple of comparisons with the XD-05 Pro to see just how good it really is when fully spec'd up, before I get there, I did want to quickly touch on the different gain modes or drive modes. The XD-05 Pro has what's called Eco Mode, Normal Mode, and Turbo Mode, and you can think of those as gain levels essentially. But it seems that maybe it's changing more than just the gain, and that's because of how it's described in the xDuoo website, and also what I heard as I changed between them. Generally speaking, gain changes won't significantly alter the sound quality. And indeed, I wouldn't say that it changes significantly as you move through the different modes on the XD-05 Pro, but it does change a little bit, and it makes me think that what they've done is favoured higher voltage in the turbo mode, higher current output perhaps in the normal mode, and then going in the other direction of just scaling everything back maybe to a true low gain mode in the Eco mode. And so just quickly, the idea of this is that Eco mode is in the XD-05 Pro with the idea of running IEMS. Having said that, you actually don't need to run IEMS in Eco mode because the noise floor doesn't change. That little hiss that I spoke about before is identical in Eco mode, normal mode, or turbo mode. And so it also then talks about on the xDuoo website that in normal mode, the XD-05 Pro is going into a Class A buffer design. And this is where I think maybe they're doing something with how the output stage is working and not just pulling back on gain. As I tried to flick between the three modes and take some notes about what I was hearing, it got a little bit tricky because the differences aren't huge, and you also have to volume match each time you change the setting. Otherwise, what you're hearing is the way we perceive louder and softer sounds, not the difference in the character of the sound coming out of the device. And so I did my best to volume match just by ear for the sake of speed in between each switch. And I think what I was hearing was that the normal mode seems to be a little bit more refined overall. Everything seems a bit more at ease, a bit more in control. Whereas going to the turbo mode, that felt like it was just a little bit more kind of brittle in the top end. It seemed less at ease and like it was working harder, pushing harder, or trying harder. Now again, the differences are very subtle here, and if you've got one of these and you've played with the modes, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, because it is tricky to really properly test these because of the delay between switching it, trying to volume match, and then listening again. But I feel like the turbo mode is maybe just a little bit brittle sounding, a little bit less at ease. And then I felt like going into the eco mode lost a bit of weight and smoothness from the mids. And so for me, I don't see any reason to move out of the normal mode unless you're running out of power, unless you feel like the amplifier is struggling in any way. And then if you are going to move out of it, it probably should only be for those situations where you've got a high impedance headphone that for some reason needs more voltage than normal mode can provide. And that really shouldn't happen. This thing's got so much power on tap that anything in my collection that I've got, various ZMFs, various Sennheisers, a Sivga headphone, none of those need any more power than this can deliver in normal mode. And so I'd probably recommend that most people get this, put it in normal mode, and go for it. And as I said before, you don't even really need to go to eco mode for IEMs, because you've got this wonderful digital volume control that's going to handle your volume range and making sure you're channel balanced all the way down to 0. And so IEMs on this can quite happily run in normal mode. You won't get a huge range of volume steps, and maybe that's one reason to go to eco mode if the steps are too big for you, but I can happily run this in normal mode with every single thing in my collection. And so that covers off the different modes, the general sound quality, the DACs, the op amps, etc. And so now it was time to find out, is the XD-05 Pro as good as some of the competition? And the first and most obvious test for me was to put it up against the Chord Mojo 2. The reason being that it's $799 US, although if you then add things like the op amps and the DAC card, we're pushing up to a $1,000 plus unit here. Putting that up against something like the Chord Mojo 2, which I haven't got in my notes, but comes in around about $700 US off the top of my head, putting those two side by side to me seemed like a good comparison, because the Mojo 2 has for a long time been my go-to for a portable reference device. It is worth noting that it will only put out 600 milliwatts, so it falls way short of something like the XD-05 Pro, and by the way, I'm talking at about 32 ohms here. So the XD-05 Pro is vastly more powerful, but as I've often talked about on the channel, there are only a few headphones on the market that you actually need that much power for, and they're probably not headphones you're going to be using in a transportable situation. And so I hooked up these using exactly the same cable, which was the USB cable that comes with the XD-05 Pro. I hooked these up and went one at a time with the same USB cable, listening to both of them. I was running the AKM DAC chip and actually the Sparkos Labs SS3602 in the XD-05 Pro, so giving it its maximum chance to be as good as it could possibly be. And listening to Solomon Sang by Cassandra Wilson, it was really a no contest. The Mojo 2 is still clearly the better sounding device. Now they've got different feature sets, different power levels, so I'm not saying that everyone should rush out and buy a Mojo 2 and just ignore the XD-05 Pro, because both have their strengths and benefits. Having said that though, there were nuances and details and textures in the sound from the Mojo 2 that I just couldn't get from the XD-05 Pro. It doesn't have the level of transparency that something like the Mojo 2 does have. You might be surprised to hear that with the Mojo 2, the bass also went deeper and with more presence. And so this is a great example where it's not about power, it's about the quality of the DAC and the quality of the amplifier. And the sense of space and separation from the Mojo 2 was still clearly superior. And so as I said before, that doesn't mean that the Mojo 2 is the right device for everybody. If you've got a balanced connection and you want to stick with that, the Mojo 2 doesn't have that. If you want Bluetooth, you have to go out and buy the Poly module, which I love from a sound quality point of view, but I hate from an interface point of view, and it's going to cost you extra. Whereas Bluetooth, it's all built into the XD-05 Pro. Likewise, if you've got a headphone like a Susvara, a Tungsten, maybe you'll work on this one, an Abyss 1266, any of those difficult headphones, the Mojo 2 is going to struggle there. Whereas you've got so much more power from the XD-05 Pro, that's probably going to work. And as I've already covered off, in isolation, the XD-05 Pro is a wonderful sounding device. The Mojo 2 is just clearly better. So if power requirements aren't a big deal, if balanced isn't a big deal, and if sound quality is your top priority, the Mojo 2 is still the better device. However, if you want some of the other features of this, and I will come back around shortly and give you a tour of this one and explain all the features, the XD-05 Pro is still lovely. And in fact, this is probably a good time to mention that the XD-05 Pro is not a product that I need in my life. For portable use, I've got the Mojo 2. And for anything more than that, I've got all my desktop gear that's at a much higher level than a $1,000 odd portable device. And yet, there is something that I just love about the interactions with the XD-05 Pro. Every now and again, a product comes along that I just adore interacting with, and the XD-05 Pro is one of them. It's so enjoyable for so many reasons. Many of those will become evident when I give you the device tour in a moment. But it's one of those things where I have an irrational joy when using this, even though I know the Mojo 2 sounds better. And so that should factor into it as well. If you enjoy the experience of using something like this more, that's going to make every listening experience more enjoyable. So I'm definitely not writing off the XD-05 Pro here, but it is worth noting that the best possible sound quality does lie elsewhere. And so with that in mind, I thought it was also worth turning to a different portable device. And I've recently reviewed the EarMen Angel, which was retailing at $799 US. It's now down to $399. I don't know if that's permanent or not. But knowing that it used to retail at $799 and is another portable device, albeit without Bluetooth, that made it an interesting comparison for me. Unfortunately, the Angel doesn't quote the output power at particular impedances. It just has a maximum voltage figure. And so I don't know exactly how they compare. I'm pretty confident and comfortable that the XD-05 Pro has more power, but because I don't know how much current it can produce at each different impedance, I don't know exactly what its maximum output is and or at which particular impedance level. So keeping in mind that the XD-05 Pro is probably more powerful, it's also currently significantly more expensive, I put the two up against each other to see what we'd hear. To scale this one back and make things a bit more comparable in terms of price, I've removed the SS3602 op amps and put the LME49720s in there. And so what we're talking about here is the $799 US base unit plus the AKM DAC card. So that is another $200, but it's getting closer to where the Angel used to sit. Running through a few tracks, I landed on Player to make some notes. That's by D'Angelo. And the first thing I noticed was that the separation of sounds and the sense of clarity was a bit better from the Angel. The Angel delivers a little bit more sense of treble energy, a little bit more sense of attack. And that takes us back to what we were talking about before with the ESS card in here versus the AKM. And the Angel does happen to be using an ESS DAC. And so I think that's what I was hearing. It makes it a little bit less relaxing to listen to, that being the Angel. But the Angel's not at all harsh because it's got a wonderful output stage on it. Moving back and forth, the XD-05 Pro does deliver better depth and layering, which again I think is coming from that DAC stage. And so you're getting a slightly thicker or smoother sound, but also better sense of space, layering and separation. And so to me, as I played around with it, I can't really separate the two. I literally enjoy both equally, and I think if I was choosing between the two of them, I'd be choosing based on the size of them, the price of them, and the feature set. If you need Bluetooth, the Angel's immediately out. If you don't have the $799 plus maybe more for a DAC card, then the XD-05 Pro is out. If you can afford either, I think it comes down to whether you want the versatility and the tweakability of the XD-05 Pro. You can obviously buy this in its stock form. It's going to go head to head with the Angel, and then you can upgrade it further with better op amps. You can change the DAC cards, etc. And so that's where the XD-05 Pro for me does have its value. But having said that, with the Angel at $399 US, if it stays at that price, it's kind of hard to justify the XD-05 Pro once again, unless you need the power, the Bluetooth, and the versatility of changing those different components. And so there's a bit of food for thought for you there, and again, it's one of those decisions that you're going to have to make based on your particular needs, your budget, etc. And keep in mind, this thing is big and heavy. That's part of what I love about it. It feels really serious, but it's not as portable as some of these other devices. Before I wrap things up there, though, on sound quality, there was one last test I wanted to try, and that was to see just how good the amp stage was within the XD-05 Pro. If you want to take it and run the internal amp, is it giving you good performance? And so for this test, what I decided to do was actually put it up against another portable device. And that was for two reasons. One of them was I wanted to see how good was the DAC in here compared to the amp. So if you put an external amp, can you get even better sound? And then also to see, is this performing at a level where if you kind of cut it down the middle at a $200 to $300 mark for each of the DAC and the amp, is it performing at or above that sort of level? And so the portable amp that I chose to reach for was the excellent topping NX7, and that comes in at $179 and offers 1.3 watts into a 32 ohm load, so it's still less powerful than this beast here. Switching between the two, the overall quality I would say is similar, but the XD-05 Pro is clearly better, and that's still running with the LME49720s, so keep in mind it can get better still. Even with the included LME49720 op amps in there, the XD-05 Pro immediately comes across with a greater sense of refinement. It also has better image separation and a bit more clarity as well. And so you're going to get more space, more clarity, more separation, and overall a more enjoyable listen from the XD-05 Pro than you will from the NX7. It's not a huge shift, but it's definitely enough to prove to me that the XD-05 Pro is performing about where it should. And that, as I said before, is with the stock op amps. In contrast, the NX7 comes across as being just a little bit edgy. It's not quite as easy to listen to, the treble seems a bit less refined, there's a bit more attack and energy in it. Some might hear it as more clarity, but to me the overall experience was less enjoyable, less separated and less clear than what I heard from the XD-05 Pro. And so I'm really comfortable that the amp and the DAC in here are performing on par with one another. I think the amplifier in here can get even better with the right op amps like the Sparkos Labs, and therefore you can get this performing to a really top tier level. It's not ever going to quite match something like the Mojo 2, but it's also quite a different device. And so it's a product that, as I've already said, I've kind of fallen in love with, even though it doesn't make a lot of sense to me compared to some of the other gear I've got, but I just keep reaching for it and wanting to use it because I enjoy its sound and I enjoy its interface. And speaking of the interface, let's quickly run through that now and then I'll summarize everything at the end. The first things I'm going to cover off is that on the bottom of the device here, there are two little doors. The door at the front undoes with two screws, it flips open, and then inside you've got the op amp card. That comes out with two more screws, and then inside there you can swap around the op amps, plug it back in, screw it together, and away you go. At the back end here we've got the door for the DAC, and that works exactly the same way. You do get a little screwdriver in the packet, and by the way the accessory set with this is nothing short of exceptional. I'll show you here on the B-roll, when you open the box, you lift up the top layer and you're greeted with everything you're likely to need. Except an optical cable, and that's a bit of a drawback, I'll talk about that in a second. If we move on though from things like the doors to access the different components, what you get on the front of the device is a 6.3mm output and a 4.4mm balanced output, as well as this lovely volume control. So that's going to give you full digital control over the device's volume. There's also a little display there so you can see the volume level you're onto. And the device even gives you the ability to turn off the different displays and choose how it's showing you what you want to see. I say the different displays because on top we've got another display, and the display on top is going to give you more information. Things like sample rate, a spectrum analyzer that's going to sort of show you little bouncing bars as the music plays. It lets you access the menu, change through the filters. There's lots of different options you can see through there. If we then go to the side of the device, we've got all your controls. You've got a power switch, your input selection button, and that means you can move through the DAC stage, the internal amplifier if you have an external input. You can also move it to Bluetooth there, of course. We've got our menu button to go through the options that as mentioned. We've got our turbo button to move through the gain modes, and then finally the Bluetooth pairing button. If we then move around to the back, we've got a switch that's going to tell it which power mode it's in, so whether it's in charging mode, whether it's battery operated, or whether you want to use an external power supply in here to give it essentially desktop power. So you can run a linear power supply into this one. I haven't tested that, I had so much else to cover, but you can run a 12-volt linear power supply into here and drive it as a desktop device if you want to. Now I wouldn't expect a huge improvement there compared to what the battery delivers, but it is something you can do, and if you've tried it and you think it's better, let us know in the comments down below. And so as you might have gathered, the USB socket you see next to this switch, that's purely for power. If we then jump over a bit, you'll see another USB socket, and that's the one where your data comes in for USB connections. We've then got a balanced in and out, and a single-ended in and out, so we've got 4.4 and 3.5mm. And the cool thing is you don't need to worry about switching these. If you're running using the internal DAC, those are running as outputs. The moment you then switch over to running just the amplifier stage, those outputs become inputs to accept the incoming analog signal. If we then move past the USB-C that I've already spoken about, we've then got a mini AES connector. That's kind of cool, but also kind of funny because you don't see a lot of devices with this mini XLR type connection. I'm guessing there's probably other xDuoo products that might have the output of that. No doubt you can adapt AES from a full-size XLR down to a mini and connect in here, but it is a little bit of a fiddly setup. I understand why they have it because you couldn't fit a full-sized XLR here, but I haven't been able to test it because I've got nothing to connect to it. And then finally, the last connection here is a dual 3.5mm socket that will accept both the long style Toslink optical connector that looks like a 3.5mm plug, or it'll accept a 3.5mm metal connector for a spit of coax cable with 3.5mm. Now again, I haven't tested the digital inputs on this other than USB, and it's because I had so much else to cover. In my experience, so long as your source devices are at a good quality level, you shouldn't find a significant difference between any of these. Once again though, if you've experienced it and you've got a favourite type of input, let us know in the comments what you like the most. For now though, I think this has gone on long enough, I don't want to drag it out any further, and so all I'm going to say is that I think the XD-05 Pro is a wonderful device. I can't say to you that it's the best device at everything it does because it's not, but it's just wildly enjoyable for me. It's a product that I want to keep coming back to and keep interacting with. It sounds very good for the price, it's got massive amounts of versatility and customization, and not just in terms of the ability to change op amps and DAC cards, but also even in terms of how it interacts with you. The information it shares with you, the modes you set it up in, the ways you choose to use it. It's very, very versatile, and I really appreciate it for that. And so I'm going to stop short of a wholehearted recommendation for this one, but I am going to say that if this sounds like a product that's going to be right for you, if you need a powerful portable or semi-transportable device, if maybe you're in a situation where you want to have a desktop system that's very compact, but still has the full power of a DAC, headphone amp, lots of power, lots of quality, this could be a wonderful option for you. And so as always, I'll put some links down below where you can read up on this one and buy it if you wish to. And they're probably going to be affiliate links, the one to Appos definitely is. And so I want to say thank you right now to anyone that purchases through those links because it's a huge support for the channel. As you'll know if you've watched for a while, it doesn't influence what I say about these products. To be clear, I get nothing for a Chord Mojo 2 sale, but I do recommend it as a better quality device over the XD-05 Pro. Having said that, we're all different. This might suit you perfectly. You might have the same sort of irrational enjoyment of it that I do. And so the links are there as a way to make your job easier and to support the channel. Thank you for any and all support. And so for now, I hope you found the video useful, helpful and informative. If you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.